Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The scent of vanilla-scented candles and freshly baked cupcakes filled the air as I stepped into the overly decorated banquet hall, my eyes scanning the sea of pastel-colored balloons, perfectly arranged flower centerpieces, and a group of women laughing too loudly at something that wasn't even funny. The whole event felt staged, artificial, like a performance being put on for an audience that had no idea what was coming. I had received the invitation weeks ago, and I had debated whether or not to come, knowing that my relationship with my younger sister Emily had always been complicated, filled with unresolved tension and unspoken resentment. But despite everything, I had told myself I would go, told myself I would be the bigger person, told myself that maybe, just maybe, this would be a step towards something better between us. I should have known better. The moment I stepped inside, my mother greeted me with that tight-lipped smile she always wore when she was about to say something passive-aggressive, her eyes scanning my face as if she was looking for something to criticize, but hadn't quite found it yet. "Lauren, you actually made it," she said, her voice laced with that same tone of condescension she had perfected over the years, the one that made me feel like I was still 15 years old and disappointing her just by existing. "Emily will be so happy you're here, especially after everything." I didn't ask what she meant by everything because I already knew it didn't matter. My mother had a way of making everything sound like it was my fault, like I was the difficult one, like I was the one who had ruined our family dynamic instead of simply refusing to play by their rules. So I just forced a polite smile, nodded, and made my way further inside, pretending not to notice the way my father barely looked up from his drink when I passed by. Emily was in the center of the room, glowing in that way that only pregnant women and people who are about to destroy your life seem to glow, surrounded by friends and extended family, accepting compliments about how radiant she looked and how lucky she was. When she saw me, her smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of something passing through her eyes before she plastered it back in place, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach as if she was protecting something. "Lauren," she said, stretching my name out as if we were old friends instead of sisters who barely spoke. "I was starting to think you weren't going to show up." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral despite the warning bells ringing in the back of my mind. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, the words tasting like a lie on my tongue, because the truth was, if I had known what was about to happen, I never would have walked through that door. The afternoon passed in a blur of forced small talk, uncomfortable glances, and a growing sense of unease settling in my chest like a storm on the horizon. I kept waiting for the moment when Emily would pull me aside and say whatever it was she had clearly been waiting to say, but she didn't. Instead, she waited until all eyes were on her, until the guests were gathered around, sipping champagne and nibbling on overpriced hors d'oeuvres, until she knew there was no escape for me. And then she dropped the bomb. "I have a very special announcement," Emily said, her voice light and airy, as if she were about to reveal the gender of the baby instead of detonating my entire world in front of a room full of people. "As you all know, this baby is a blessing, and I couldn't be more excited to be a mother, but what makes this even more special is that the father of my child was someone very dear to me." I felt the shift in the room before the words even left her mouth, the sudden, tangible tension as everyone seemed to sense that something was coming, something heavy, something ugly. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to stop whatever was about to happen, but before I could, she smiled directly at me and said the words that sent an icy chill down my spine. "My baby's father was Daniel," she announced, her voice filled with feigned emotion, as if she had rehearsed this moment, as if she had prepared herself to make this as dramatic as possible. "Lauren's late husband." The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me from all angles as the words sank in, as gasps filled the air, as every single person in the room turned to look at me, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if I would cry, if I would scream, if I would collapse under the weight of it. But I did none of those things. Instead, I just stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing through every possible explanation, every possible way this could be a misunderstanding, a cruel joke, a mistake. But Emily wasn't laughing. She was standing there, her hand on her stomach, her eyes locked onto mine, and I realized in that moment that she wasn't just saying this to hurt me, she was saying it because she wanted something. And then she made it clear exactly what that was. As Daniel's child, she continued, her voice steady, unwavering, rehearsed, my baby is entitled to his inheritance. And as his widow, Lauren, I know you'll want to do the right thing. The right thing. I almost laughed at the audacity of it, at the way she said it so casually, as if she hadn't just shattered what little I had left of my husband's memory, as if she wasn't standing there, using an unborn child as a bargaining chip, as if she actually believed I would let her get away with this. But instead of laughing, instead of crying, instead of letting her see even a flicker of the storm raging inside me, I reached into my bag, my fingers wrapping around the documents I had been carrying for weeks, the ones I had brought today on a gut instinct I couldn't explain. I pulled them out, unfolded them slowly, and held them up for her to see. And that was the moment Emily's face turned completely white. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire room seemed frozen in place, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating, a collective silence hanging between the guests as everyone's eyes darted between me and Emily, waiting to see what would happen next. The color had drained from her face, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the papers in my grasp, her entire body going rigid as if she had been caught in a lie so big that even she wasn't sure how to wriggle her way out of it. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, not from fear or sadness, but from a deep, simmering rage that had been building ever since she had spoken Daniel's name in front of all these people, using his memory as a weapon, twisting the last remnants of my life with him into something ugly, something grotesque, something she thought she could control. Emily let out a forced, breathy laugh, her lips curling into a tight, shaky smile as she shook her head slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table beside her for balance. "Lauren, you really are something else," she said, her voice lighter than it should have been, as if she was trying to play this off as a misunderstanding, as if she still believed she could turn this in her favor. "What? Did you come here with some kind of plan? Bring fake documents just to embarrass me in front of everyone?" I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let her words pull me into whatever game she thought she was playing. Instead, I slowly unfolded the papers, holding them up so she could see every word printed in black and white, my voice steady when I finally spoke. "This is from Daniel's doctor," I said, watching the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her breath coming faster now, her carefully rehearsed facade starting to crack. "He had a vasectomy 5 years ago. That means, Emily, there is no possible way that baby is his." A collective gasp rippled through the room, whispered murmurs breaking out among the guests, the weight of my words crashing down like a tidal wave that Emily had not been prepared for. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face flushing a deep shade of red, her mouth opening and closing as if she was scrambling to find something, anything, that could explain her way out of this. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the desperation flickering behind her eyes as she realized, in real time, that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. Our mother, who had been sitting stiffly at the table just moments ago, shot up from her chair, her expression dark with anger, her voice sharp as she turned toward me with the kind of scolding tone she had used on me since childhood. "Lauren, where did you even get that?" she demanded, her arms crossing over her chest as if she could somehow intimidate me into backing down. "You've always been jealous of Emily, and now you're trying to humiliate her in front of everyone? You should be ashamed of yourself." I let out a slow, humorless laugh, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of her words, at the way she could stand there and defend Emily even in the face of irrefutable proof. "Jealous?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief, my grip tightening on the papers in my hands. "You really think I made this up? That I just invented medical records out of thin air to ruin her baby shower? Face it, Mom," Emily lied. "And the only person who should be ashamed right now is her." Emily's breath hitched, her lower lip trembling as she shook her head again, her voice cracking when she finally spoke. "That's not true," she whispered, but there was no conviction behind her words, no real belief in them. I have proof. I have a DNA test. It proves that Daniel is the father." Something inside me went ice cold at her words, my body tensing as a new wave of suspicion crawled up my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "A DNA test?" I echoed, my fingers curling around the papers in my grasp, my entire being screaming at me that something wasn't right. Funny, because I don't recall Daniel giving any samples before he died. "So tell me, Emily, exactly how did you manage to get a DNA test from a man who's been dead for 2 years?" Her entire body flinched as if I had struck her, her eyes darting to our mother in silent desperation, searching for help, for some kind of escape. But before anyone could speak, before another lie could slip past her lips, something else clicked in my mind, something I hadn't thought about before, something that sent a chill straight through my bones. Daniel's medical records. I had spent months drowning in grief after his death, unable to do anything but survive, unable to look too deeply into things that didn't make sense because the pain had been too much to bear. But now, standing there, staring at my sister who had just fabricated an entire life inside her womb, I realized there was something I had overlooked, something important. Daniel had been hospitalized just 3 months before he died. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, had assumed it was routine, had believed what the doctors told me when they said there was nothing to worry about. But now, for the first time, I felt the suffocating weight of a question I had never thought to ask. Why had he been in the hospital? I reached into my purse, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone, my breath catching in my throat as I started scrolling through old emails, searching for anything, any record, any report, any clue that could tell me what had really happened in those last few months of his life. And then, just as my fingers landed on an old hospital bill, just as I felt the first pulse of fear shoot through my veins, my phone vibrated in my hand, a new message flashing across the screen. "Stop asking questions. Walk away." My blood ran cold as I stared at the words, my heart pounding against my ribs, my entire body going still as the realization sank in. This wasn't just about Emily. This was something much, much bigger. The words on my phone screen seemed to pulse with an eerie finality, the stark white text against the dark background drilling into my mind like a warning that came too late. A threat from someone who had been watching me long before I even realized there was something to uncover. My fingers tightened around the edges of the device, my breath coming faster now, my pulse thudding in my ears like a drumbeat urging me to stop, to turn back, to pretend that I had never seen the cracks in the perfect story I had been fed about Daniel's death. But the thing about secrets, especially the kind that people are willing to threaten you over, is that once you realize they exist, they fester in your mind like an open wound, impossible to ignore, impossible to leave alone. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to push past the fear curling in my gut, forced myself to focus on what I knew, on what I still needed to find out. If Daniel had been hospitalized just months before his death and no one had ever told me why, then that meant someone had gone out of their way to keep me in the dark, and that alone was enough to send a fresh wave of fury coursing through my veins. Grief had kept me blind before, had kept me from questioning things that didn't add up, but now that I had seen the first sliver of truth, there was no going back. I spent the rest of the night combing through old emails, digging up every hospital bill, every insurance claim, every scrap of information I had ignored in the months following Daniel's passing. My fingers trembling slightly as I pieced together a version of events that suddenly felt far more sinister than the one I had been given. And that was when I found it, the transaction that didn't belong, a wire transfer made to an account I didn't recognize, a sum of money large enough to make my stomach turn. Daniel had never mentioned having another account, had never kept financial secrets from me, had never given me any reason to believe there were parts of his life I didn't know about. But there it was, buried beneath layers of forgotten records, an account in his name that I had never seen before, holding money that had seemingly vanished without a trace. My hands shook as I wrote down every detail, my mind racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last, each one pointing to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. By the time the sun started to rise, casting slivers of dull gray light through my blinds, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer, knew that there was only one person who held the missing piece to this puzzle, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Emily. The moment I stepped onto her front porch, I could already hear the movement inside, the sound of hurried footsteps, the clinking of glass against countertops, the faint hum of a television playing in the background. I knocked harder than necessary, the adrenaline still coursing through me, my patience already razor-thin after everything she had done, after everything she had put me through, after the lies, after the manipulation. After the humiliation she had tried to force on me in front of an entire room of people. She opened the door hesitantly, her face pale, her expression unreadable, but the way her eyes darted behind me, scanning the street like she expected someone to be watching, told me that she was more afraid than she wanted to let on. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, lacking the usual confidence, the usual smugness, the usual ability to turn everything in her favor. I didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't bother pretending that there was any point in playing nice, didn't even step inside before I dropped the first bomb. "Who is the father, Emily?" I asked, my voice sharp, unwavering, unwilling to give her an inch of ground to stand on. "Because we both know it's not Daniel." She flinched like I had physically struck her, her mouth opening slightly before she clamped it shut, her hands tightening around the edge of the doorframe as if she was bracing herself for impact. "I don't have to tell you anything," she said, but her voice cracked slightly, her body betraying the lie before the words had even fully left her mouth. I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she had to lean in to hear me, just enough to make sure she felt the weight of what I was about to say. "Then why are you so scared?" I asked, watching the way her breath hitched, watching the way she avoided my eyes, watching the way she seemed to shrink into herself like a cornered animal. "Because, Emily, you don't look like someone who's just trying to get a payday. You look like someone who knows exactly what they've gotten themselves into, and you look like someone who wishes they could take it back." For the first time since this all started, I saw something real flicker across her face, fear, regret, something that almost made me believe that, for all the damage she had done, she had never intended for it to go this far. Before she could answer, before I could press her any further, another voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with a familiar kind of authority, one that made my skin crawl even before I turned to face the source. "Enough." Our mother stood at the edge of the porch, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold in a way that sent an immediate warning through my bloodstream. "You need to let this go, Lauren," she said, stepping closer, lowering her voice in that way she always did when she wanted to make it seem like she was acting in my best interest. "Some things are better left buried." The words sent a chill through me, an unspoken threat lingering beneath them, a final warning wrapped in the guise of motherly concern. But she didn't realize something. She didn't understand that the moment you tell someone to stop digging is the exact moment they start digging harder. And that was exactly what I planned to do. By the time I returned home that night, exhaustion pressing against my bones, my mind still reeling from the conversation, I found myself going through Daniel's belongings for the first time in months, searching for anything I might have missed. Anything that might tell me why my mother had just told me to stop looking. And then, tucked inside an old box of his things, buried beneath faded photographs and forgotten mementos, I found it, a small, rusted key attached to a slip of paper, Daniel's handwriting scrawled across it in uneven, hurried strokes. "Not safe. Trust no one." My breath caught at my throat as my fingers traced the letters, as realization slowly dawned on me, as my pulse quickened with the weight of what I was holding. I knew this key. It belonged to a safety deposit box. One I had never heard of. One I had never known existed. The key sat in the palm of my hand, its surface worn and scratched, the metal cool against my skin as I stared down at it, my mind racing through every possibility, every question, every dark corner of doubt that had begun to take root in my thoughts. Daniel had hidden this key for a reason, tucked it away with a note that sent a chill down my spine, a warning that felt like it had been written not just for me, but for himself, a final, desperate message from a man who had known something he wasn't supposed to know. I wasted no time, grabbing my coat and car keys, my body moving on autopilot as I drove across town, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The bank was quiet when I arrived, the cold sterility of the lobby making the tension in my chest tighten, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs as I approached the clerk, the small key burning a hole in my pocket. I handed over my identification, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, and within minutes, I was being escorted down a narrow hallway, the polished floor reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead, each step bringing me closer to whatever truth Daniel had hidden away. The vault door opened with a heavy, mechanical groan, the scent of aged paper and steel filling the air as I stepped inside, my eyes immediately locking onto the small metal box bearing Daniel's name. My hands shook slightly as I lifted it from the shelf, setting it on the table in front of me, my breath hitching in my throat as I hesitated for just a moment before sliding the key into the lock. The latch clicked, the lid creaked open, and as I stared down at the contents inside, I felt my entire world tilt beneath me. The first thing I saw was a stack of neatly folded documents, pages that looked old but well-preserved, the top one stamped with the words Last Will and Testament of Daniel Carter. My heart stopped for a beat, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the papers, my eyes scanning the lines of text, my breath catching as I realized exactly what I was holding. This wasn't the will I had been shown after his death, wasn't the legal document that had been read to me in that cold office surrounded by lawyers and family members who had already decided I didn't deserve a say in anything. This was a different will. A newer one. And it changed everything. Daniel had rewritten his will just weeks before his death, altering every detail, cutting out the very people who had fought so hard to take control of his estate. Emily, my parents, everyone who had assumed they would benefit from his passing. His entire fortune, his business shares, his property, everything had been left solely to me, with explicit instructions that no one else was to receive a single cent. My pulse pounded in my ears as I flipped through the pages, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what this meant, of why no one had ever told me about this, of why the will I had been given had looked so different. Because this one had never been filed. Someone had made sure of that. Before I could even begin to process it, my fingers brushed against something else inside the box, something that sent a fresh wave of nausea through me the moment I saw it. A photograph, tucked between the pages of legal documents, its edges slightly curled, as if someone had handled it too many times, as if it had been placed there with purpose, as if it had been meant to be found. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting as I turned the photo over, my breath catching the moment my eyes landed on the image. Emily. She was standing outside a cafe, her expression serious, her body angled toward the man sitting across from her, a man I would have recognized anywhere, even through the grainy quality of the photograph, even though I had never seen them together like this before. Daniel. They were talking, leaning in close, his face unreadable, her mouth slightly open as if she had been mid-sentence, as if whatever she had been saying had been important. The date on the bottom corner sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This photo had been taken just 2 weeks before his death. I gripped the edges of the picture, my pulse hammering so loudly that I could barely think, my mind a blur of questions that had no immediate answers. Why had Daniel been meeting with Emily in secret? Why had he changed his will right before he died? Why had no one ever told me about any of this? I dug deeper into the box, pulling out the last few items, a small notebook filled with hastily scrawled notes in Daniel's handwriting, receipts from meetings at places I had never known he went to, a crumpled letter with a single line underlined in red ink. They know. It's not safe. If anything happens to me, find the will. Trust no one. My breath came in short gasps, my hands shaking as I realized exactly what this meant, as the truth began to crystallize in my mind with horrifying clarity. Daniel had known something, had uncovered something, had tried to protect himself, and then, just weeks later, he was gone. His death, the will, the sudden rush to divide his estate, Emily's bizarre claims about her baby's paternity, it wasn't just bad luck, wasn't just coincidence, wasn't just the cruelty of fate. This had been planned. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure I never found out. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to shove the documents back into the box, to lock it up once more before stepping out of the vault, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me as I made my way back to my car, my fingers tightening around my phone as I scrolled to Emily's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant, uncertain, as if she had been expecting me to call. "We need to talk," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, my grip tightening around the wheel. There was a pause, then a quiet exhale, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I know." A chill ran down my spine as I sat there, gripping the phone, staring at the road ahead of me, knowing that I was only just beginning to scratch the surface of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth. The house was silent when I stepped inside, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, suffocating, the kind that pressed against my skin like an unseen force, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. My parents were seated in the living room, their faces carefully blank, their bodies rigid with tension, their hands folded in their laps as if they were preparing for a polite conversation instead of the storm that was about to rip through every carefully placed lie they had ever told. Emily sat in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting toward the door like she was calculating whether she could escape before I said what I had come to say. I closed the door behind me slowly, the sound of the latch clicking into place unnervingly loud in the stillness, my fingers tightening around the stack of documents in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest with a mixture of anger, determination, and something dangerously close to satisfaction. I had spent too long being lied to, too long being manipulated, too long letting them paint me as the difficult one, the ungrateful daughter, the stubborn sister who never knew when to let things go. But now I had the truth in my hands, and there was no version of this where they walked away unscathed. "Sit down," I said, my voice sharp, leaving no room for argument, no space for my mother's usual theatrics or my father's cold dismissals. "We're going to talk about Daniel's will. The real one." I watched the color drain from my mother's face, her fingers twitching against the fabric of her dress, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. My father exhaled slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable, his posture stiff as if he already knew exactly what was coming. Emily didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even try to defend herself, and for the first time, I saw something real flicker across her face, not defiance, not smugness, not the calculated manipulation she had wielded so effortlessly before, but fear. "You knew," I continued, my grip tightening around the papers, my breath steady despite the fury boiling beneath my skin. "You knew Daniel changed his will before he died. You knew he left everything to me. You knew he cut all of you out completely. And instead of telling me, instead of respecting his wishes, you made sure that will disappeared, didn't you?" My mother's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her gaze darting toward my father as if hoping he would find a way to fix this, to make it all go away, to somehow pull the strings the way he always had. But there was no fixing this, no erasing what I had already uncovered, no charming their way out of the fact that they had committed fraud, that they had tampered with legal documents, that they had taken what didn't belong to them and counted on me being too grief-stricken to ever notice. My father finally leaned forward, his voice calm, measured, but laced with something sharp beneath the surface, something cold and ruthless and tired of pretending. "You don't understand, Lauren," he said, his words slow, deliberate, as if he was speaking to a child instead of his grown daughter. Daniel wasn't thinking clearly when he made those changes. He was being paranoid, convinced people were out to get him, making decisions that weren't rational. "We were protecting you." I let out a slow, humorless laugh, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of his words, at the way he still, even now, thought he could manipulate me into believing that he had done this for my own good. "Protecting me?" I repeated, my voice cold, my fingers tightening around the pages in my hand. "Is that why you let Emily stand in front of a room full of people and humiliate me? Is that why you let her claim her baby was Daniel's when you knew damn well it wasn't true?" My mother flinched, her hands curling into fists in her lap, but she didn't deny it, didn't even try to argue, because what excuse could she possibly have? Emily finally moved then, her head snapping up, her face pale, but her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with the last remnants of defiance she had left. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice shaky but laced with desperation, with something close to hysteria. "I have proof. I have a DNA test that proves Daniel is the father." I turned to her slowly, my body going still, my lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, you don't," I said, my voice deadly quiet, my heart pounding as I reached into my bag and pulled out yet another document, this one smaller, more damning, more dangerous than all the others combined. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the paper, as realization started to creep into her expression, as her fingers twitched at her sides. "This," I said, unfolding the page, holding it up so she had no choice but to look at it, "is a report from the lab you used to fake your DNA test. Turns out, when you try to forge legal documents, there are digital footprints. And when you're dumb enough to bribe someone to alter the results, it only takes one phone call to have everything traced back to you." The room went silent again, the weight of my words sinking in, the last thread of Emily's deception snapping right in front of me. I let the moment linger, let the air grow heavier, let the full gravity of what I had done settle into their bones before I pulled out the final document, the one that mattered the most. "The real will," I said, laying it down on the table, my eyes locking onto my father's as I delivered the final blow. "It's all ready with a lawyer. There's nothing you can do to stop it now. You get nothing. Emily gets nothing. And the fraud charges? Those are coming too." My mother inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes going wide with panic, with disbelief, with the sudden, horrifying realization that everything they had stolen, everything they had fought to keep, everything they had built their betrayal on was crumbling to dust right in front of them. And just as I turned to leave, just as I stepped toward the door, my phone buzzed, a new message lighting up the screen, the words sending a fresh wave of ice through my veins. "A letter has been waiting for you. He knew you'd find it. Now you're ready to know why he changed everything." My breath hitched, my fingers tightening around the phone as I stared at the message, my pulse pounding in my ears. Daniel had left me something else. And whatever it was the final piece of the puzzle. The letter arrived in an unmarked envelope, its edges slightly worn as if it had been handled too many times before reaching me, the weight of it feeling heavier than paper should be, heavier than I was ready for, heavier than anything I had held since the day I signed Daniel's death certificate and convinced myself I understood what loss really meant. My fingers trembled as I slid my nail beneath the flap, peeling it open slowly, carefully, almost afraid of what I was about to find inside, almost afraid that the final words of my husband, the man I had loved more than life itself, would shatter whatever fragile sense of understanding I had managed to put together in the wreckage of everything that had happened. The letter wasn't long, but the words on the page struck like a hammer against glass, each sentence cracking the carefully built illusions I had been fed, each revelation tightening a vice around my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except let the truth finally, fully sink in. "Lauren, if you're reading this, it means you've found the will. It means you've figured out at least part of what's been happening. It means you didn't let them break you the way they always wanted to. But there's something else you need to know. Something I couldn't tell you before. Something I was too afraid to say out loud because I knew they were watching, listening, waiting for me to slip. Your parents aren't just greedy. They aren't just manipulative. They aren't just the kind of people who use their children like pawns in a game they think they can control. They're dangerous, Lauren. And they have been for a long, long time." My breath hitched in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears as my eyes flicked to the next line, my mind racing through every moment, every red flag, every time my mother had told me to stop digging. Every time my father had looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be loved. I know about Emily. I know they used her just like they used me. I know they convinced her to lie, to set you up, to keep you distracted while they worked to erase every trace of what I left behind. But, Lauren, That's not the worst part. They didn't just steal money. They didn't just forge documents. They didn't just manipulate everyone around them to get what they wanted. They've done this before. I could feel my hands shaking, my entire body going still, a deep, primal kind of fear settling into my bones, the kind that only comes when you realize you've been living in a story where you were never meant to survive. I found records, hidden away in places they thought no one would ever look. I found bank statements tied to accounts that shouldn't exist. I found legal documents that had been altered. I found death certificates that didn't match the stories they told. And then I found the worst thing of all. I found proof that someone else tried to fight them once, just like I did. And they didn't make it out. A cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck, my vision swimming slightly as I forced myself to keep reading, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts, the weight of Daniel's words pressing against me like a vice. Lauren, I don't know if my death was an accident, and I don't know if I was supposed to be next, but I do know one thing: you are always going to be the last piece of their puzzle. And if you've made it this far, then it means you're closer to the truth than they ever wanted you to be. Don't stop now. Don't let them win. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone. The letter ended there, no goodbye, no signature, just those last, ominous words written in the same hurried, frantic handwriting that had scrawled "not safe. Trust no one" on the slip of paper that led me to the safety deposit box. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat, my hands gripping the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath my fingers, my mind replaying every moment, every warning. Every time I had ignored the feeling that something was wrong. And then my phone buzzed. A single message. "You're finally seeing the truth." But there's more. No sender. No number. No explanation. Just those words, staring back at me, cutting through the darkness like a blade, a taunt, a challenge, a promise that this wasn't over. I lifted my head slowly, staring at the screen, my breath steadying, my fingers tightening around the phone, my pulse still pounding, but for a different reason now. Because they had spent my entire life underestimating me. And now, for the first time, I had no intention of walking away.